My brother had me committed to steal my inheritance, so I spent 2 years in there planning exactly how I'd destroy his life. It started the night before my 21st birthday. I was supposed to inherit my grandfather's empire, 3 hotels, 2 restaurants, and enough real estate to make me independently wealthy. Damien knew this. He also knew I'd been struggling with anxiety after our parents died in that car crash 6 months earlier. The crash that killed them wasn't an accident, though I didn't know that yet. Damien had been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the only people standing between him and our grandfather's fortune. He tampered with Dad's brake lines while they were at dinner celebrating their anniversary. The police called it mechanical failure. Metal fatigue, they said. Happens all the time with older vehicles. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night, as I practiced my inheritance speech in my bedroom, I had no idea my brother was a murderer. I thought he was just being protective when he expressed concern about my erratic behavior to our family doctor. I thought Mrs. Patterson was just a nosy neighbor when she called the police about me talking to myself at all hours. "You've been talking to yourself again," he said, standing in my bedroom doorway with 2 paramedics behind him. "The neighbors are concerned." I wasn't talking to myself. I was practicing my speech for the inheritance ceremony, rehearsing what I'd say to the board of directors who would officially transfer everything to me at midnight. But when you're 20 years old, grieving and isolated, who's going to believe you over your older brother who's been taking care of you since the funeral? The commitment papers were already signed. Binder Holloway, our family physician who'd been taking Damien's money for months, had declared me mentally unstable, dangerous to myself and others. He cited my erratic behavior and paranoid delusions about family members conspiring against me. The medical report was 3 pages of fabricated symptoms, auditory hallucinations, violent outbursts toward family members, threats of self-harm. None of it was true, but Dr. Holloway had been documenting fictional appointments for weeks, building a paper trail that would justify emergency commitment. He'd even backdated some of the entries to make it look like my mental health had been deteriorating for months. The paramedics were gentle but firm as they loaded me into the ambulance. I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door peeking through her curtains, probably feeling vindicated for calling in her concern about the disturbed girl talking to herself all hours of the night. What Mrs. Patterson didn't know was that Damien had been paying her monthly rent for 6 months, ensuring she'd be a reliable witness to my deteriorating mental state. He'd even installed a sound system in the bushes outside my window that played recordings of me having imaginary conversations he'd spliced together from old family videos and voicemails I'd left him over the years. "I'll take good care of everything while you're getting better," Damien promised, squeezing my hand through the ambulance window. His eyes were already calculating. I could see him mentally spending my inheritance. He'd probably called his broker before the ambulance even left our driveway. As we pulled away from the mansion, I caught a glimpse of him in the side mirror, already on his phone, probably calling his lawyer to start the paperwork for his emergency guardianship petition. He'd thought of everything except the possibility that I might be smarter than he was. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital became my home for the next 24 months. Not because I was actually sick, but because Damien had paid the right people to keep me there. Every time I seemed close to discharge, Dr. Holloway would find new reasons to extend my stay. Still showing signs of delusional thinking. Hasn't fully accepted her condition. Needs more time to stabilize. The hospital itself was a nightmare of fluorescent lights, industrial carpeting, and the constant smell of disinfectant mixed with human despair. My room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional green that seems designed to drain hope from anyone who looks at it. The irony wasn't lost on me that my real paranoia about Damien's conspiracy was being used as evidence of my mental illness. Each time I tried to explain what had really happened, the staff would exchange those knowing looks and increase my medication dosage. Dr. Holloway would nod sympathetically and make notes about my persistent delusions and inability to accept reality. The first 3 months were the hardest. The antipsychotics made everything foggy, and I could barely think clearly enough to remember my own name, let alone plan any kind of revenge. I stumbled through group therapy sessions, drooling on myself and mumbling incoherently, while other patients shared their genuine struggles with addiction and depression. I felt terrible for them. These were real people with real problems, trying to get better, while I was just a kidnapping victim drugged into submission. There was Maria, a teenage girl recovering from a suicide attempt after being sexually abused by her stepfather. There was Frank, a Vietnam veteran with PTSD who'd been homeless for 3 years before his family finally got him help. There was Dorothy, an elderly woman with dementia whose children had dumped her there because they couldn't handle her care. All of them deserved to be there. All of them were getting real help. And here I was, perfectly sane, taking up space and resources because my brother wanted my money. But gradually, I learned to cheek the pills and spit them out later. I started palming them during medication time and flushing them down the toilet in my room. The nurses barely paid attention during pill distribution. They had 30 patients to medicate twice a day, and as long as I opened my mouth and swallowed, they moved on to the next person. Slowly, my mind cleared, and I began to understand the magnitude of what Damien had done. He'd stolen everything. Not just my inheritance, but my freedom, my identity, my future. He'd convinced everyone I loved that I was dangerously mentally ill. He destroyed my reputation, my relationships, and my credibility. Even if I ever got out, who would believe the word of a woman who'd spent years in a psychiatric hospital? But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And anger, it turns out, is an excellent motivator for detailed planning. But here's what Damien didn't count on. Psychiatric hospitals have computers. And I'd been a computer science major before everything fell apart. While other patients watched TV or attended group therapy, I spent my time in the computer lab, supposedly working on therapeutic digital art. The computer lab was run by a well-meaning volunteer named Timothy, a sweet kid in his early 20s who worked part-time in the hospital's IT department while finishing his degree at the local community college. He thought I was just another tragic patient who needed something positive to focus on. When I mentioned I'd studied programming before my breakdown, he started bringing me coding challenges to keep my mind sharp. Timothy had no idea that I'd been valedictorian of my computer science program before everything fell apart. He thought he was teaching me basic HTML and CSS, not realizing I was using his administrative credentials to systematically breach the hospital's network security. "You're really getting good at this," he'd say, watching me work on what he thought were simple website designs. "Have you considered going back to school when you get out? I bet you could get a job in tech." Poor Timothy. He was genuinely trying to help me build skills for my reintegration into society. He had no idea I was using every minute of computer access to build a comprehensive case against the people who'd destroyed my life. What Timothy didn't know was that I was using his administrative access to breach the hospital's network, then piggyback onto external systems. Every time he stepped away for coffee or to help another patient, I was accessing databases, financial records, and communication systems that should have been completely secure. The hospital's cybersecurity was laughably weak. They'd focused all their security measures on keeping patients from accessing inappropriate content or communicating with the outside world, but they'd never considered that someone might use the computers to investigate their own imprisonment. Most of the patients in the computer lab could barely use email. The idea that one of them might be hacking into financial institutions was beyond their imagination. I started small, testing the limits of what I could access: hospital records, employee databases, vendor contracts. Then I moved outward: city records, state databases, federal systems. Each successful breach taught me more about network security and gave me access to new information sources. The first step was understanding what Damien had done since my commitment. I created fake social media accounts and slowly pieced together his activities from his own posts and his girlfriend's Instagram stories. He was living in our family mansion, driving my grandfather's vintage cars, and telling everyone he was managing the estate until Vera recovers. But the social media post revealed so much more than I'd expected. Photos of him in my father's study, wearing our grandfather's watch, hosting parties with business associates who should have been my contacts. He'd completely assumed my identity and my future, living the life that was supposed to be mine. I discovered he was engaged to Sloan Whitmore, the daughter of our biggest hotel chain competitor. The engagement wasn't love. It was a business merger designed to consolidate control over the entire regional hospitality market. Our grandfather's empire plus the Whitmore fortune would create an unassailable monopoly. The engagement photos made me physically sick. There was Damien in a designer tuxedo, standing in our family's rose garden with this beautiful blonde woman who was wearing what should have been my grandmother's engagement ring. The caption read, "So excited to merge our families and our businesses. Can't wait to build an empire together." He was literally using my inheritance as a dowry to buy himself a wife and a business alliance. But I needed deeper access than social media could provide. So I began cultivating Timothy's trust more deliberately. I started asking him about his classes, his girlfriend, his dreams of working for a major tech company after graduation. I listened to his problems and offered advice based on my business education. I became the kind of patient he felt good about helping: intelligent, grateful, clearly improving under his care. "You know, you're one of the success stories," he told me after I'd been there 8 months. "When you first came in, you could barely string a sentence together. Now look at you. You're learning programming, you're engaging in therapy, you're making real progress. Dr. Holloway should be proud." I smiled and thanked him, all while using his login credentials to access Dr. Holloway's personal email account. After 6 months, Timothy trusted me enough to leave me alone in the computer lab for hours at a time. He'd given me my own login credentials and stopped monitoring my screen time. He thought I was creating digital art therapy projects and writing in online journals about my recovery journey. Instead, I was systematically infiltrating every system Damien touched. First, I accessed our family's business accounts. Damien had changed all the passwords, but he'd always been predictably lazy with security questions. His new password was Damien Wins 2024, typical of his arrogance. The security questions were even easier: our mother's maiden name, the street where we grew up, our first pet's name, information I'd known since childhood. Within weeks, I had complete access to everything: bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, business partnerships, employee records, insurance policies, legal documents, everything Damien thought he'd hidden behind new passwords and security protocols. What I discovered made me physically sick. He'd been embezzling from the hotels since the day after our parents' funeral, skimming money from employee paychecks and pocketing the difference, inflating vendor contracts and kickbacks to his personal accounts, selling off valuable art and furniture from the hotel lobbies and replacing them with cheap imitations. He'd stolen over $400,000 in just 18 months. The theft was systematic and sophisticated. He'd created fake vendor accounts that paid into his personal banking. He'd set up a consulting company that charged the hotels for management services that didn't exist. He'd even been stealing from the employee pension fund, gambling that no one would notice until after he'd secured permanent control of the businesses. But the financial crimes were nothing compared to what I found in his personal files. Emails with Dr. Holloway dating back 8 months before I was committed, planning every detail of my imprisonment. Damien had paid him $50,000 up front, plus $10,000 per month to keep me institutionalized indefinitely. They discussed medication protocols designed to keep me docile and confused, therapy approaches that would reinforce my delusional thinking, and strategies for discrediting anything I might say about their conspiracy. The emails were chilling in their casual cruelty. Dr. Holloway wrote about me like I was a lab rat in an experiment. Subject is responding well to increased haloperidol dosage. Cognitive function significantly impaired. Recommend continuing current protocol for another 6 months to ensure long-term compliance. Damien's responses were even worse. Perfect. The longer she's in there, the stronger my guardianship case becomes. By the time anyone questions her commitment, it'll be too late to challenge the inheritance transfer. I found recordings of phone calls between Damien and Sloan where they laughed about my condition. Poor little Vera. Sloan's voice was sickeningly sweet on the audio files, talking to imaginary people and thinking everyone's out to get her. Maybe the family just has bad genes. Don't worry, Damien replied. The doctors say she'll probably never be competent enough to live independently. I'll be her guardian for life, which means I'll control everything forever. They'd discussed having me moved to a long-term care facility once the inheritance was fully transferred. Not for medical reasons, but to keep me permanently out of the way. They wanted me alive but powerless, drugged into submission, and locked away where I could never challenge their control. But the worst discovery was buried in Damien's encrypted personal files. Detailed plans for murdering our parents, going back 18 months before the crash. He'd researched car accident statistics, studied brake line vulnerabilities, and even practiced the sabotage technique on a junked car he'd bought under a fake name. The crash wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was premeditated murder designed to look like mechanical failure. He'd documented everything like a proud engineer presenting a thesis project, photos of the tools he'd used to cut the brake lines, audio recordings of himself practicing the concerned son routine he'd perform for police investigators, even shopping receipts for the equipment, purchased with cash at different stores across 3 counties, to avoid creating a traceable pattern. There were also drafts of the emotional speech he'd given at their funeral. He'd practiced his grief, rehearsed his tears, planned every word to maximize sympathy and deflect suspicion. The man who'd stood at our parents' graveside and sobbed about how much he'd missed them had spent weeks planning their deaths. But Damien's arrogance was also his weakness. He'd kept digital copies of everything, convinced that his password protection and encryption were sufficient to hide his crimes. He documented his murders, his theft, his conspiracy to imprison me, and his plans for the future, all in neat digital folders with labels like Project Inheritance and Vera Problem. The Vera Problem folder was particularly disturbing. It contained psychological profiles he'd compiled about me, strategies for isolating me from friends and potential allies, and contingency plans for different scenarios. If I'd refused to be committed voluntarily, he had backup plans involving drug overdoses that would look like suicide attempts. If I'd tried to expose him, he had character assassination strategies ready to deploy. He'd thought of everything except the possibility that I might actually be smarter than he was. For 18 months, I built an airtight case against him. Screenshots of financial records showing every stolen dollar. Email chains where he bragged to business associates about his brilliant manipulation of the family fortune. Voice recordings from his office that I accessed by remotely activating his laptop's microphone during important meetings. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. The entire murder plot against our parents, documented in his own words with photographic evidence. But I didn't just gather evidence. I began implementing a comprehensive plan to destroy every aspect of his life. I started with small acts of sabotage, anonymous tips to the IRS about unreported income, filed through untraceable email accounts created using the hospital's public computers, fake reviews tanking his hotel's ratings, carefully spaced out over months to look like legitimate customer complaints about everything from dirty rooms to food poisoning at the restaurants. The reviews were masterfully crafted. I'd studied hospitality management as part of my business degree, so I knew exactly which complaints would hurt most. Stories about finding insects in hotel beds, getting sick from undercooked food at the restaurants, discovering hidden cameras in guest rooms, witnessing staff stealing from guests. Each review was detailed and specific enough to seem credible, but not so dramatic as to seem fake. I targeted the hotel's peak booking seasons, creating waves of negative reviews just before major holidays and local events, when rooms would normally be sold out. I researched the names of real guests from previous years, and created fake accounts using their information, making the reviews even more believable. Within 6 months, the flagship hotel's rating had dropped from 4.8 stars to 2.1 stars. Booking reservations fell by 60%. Corporate clients started canceling events and moving their business to competitor hotels. But online reviews were just the beginning. I hacked into the hotel booking systems and occasionally canceled high-value reservations at the last minute, making it look like system glitches. I manipulated the online pricing algorithms to randomly spike room rates during peak booking periods, driving potential customers to competitor hotels. I sent mysterious emails to wedding planners and event coordinators, suggesting they might want to reconsider booking venues with recent management instability. I also targeted the restaurant's supply chains. I created fake accounts with food service vendors and placed enormous orders for expensive ingredients, then canceled them at the last minute, leaving the restaurants with shortages during busy periods. I hacked into the restaurant management software and occasionally changed reservation times, creating chaos during peak dining hours. Meanwhile, I was targeting Damien's personal life with surgical precision. I created a fake dating profile using photos of an attractive woman named Rebecca, actually a model from stock photo websites, whose images I'd carefully edited to look like casual selfies, taken with different phones and cameras. After months of online flirtation, Damien was completely smitten. I studied his communication patterns from his emails and text messages, learning exactly how to manipulate his ego and his psychological weaknesses. Rebecca was everything Sloan wasn't: spontaneous, adventurous, intellectually curious about his business, She sent him poetry and philosophical questions. She challenged his business decisions and offered alternative perspectives. She made him feel like the brilliant, misunderstood entrepreneur he'd always imagined himself to be. The Rebecca persona took months to develop properly. I studied psychology textbooks from the hospital library, learning about narcissistic personality traits and how to exploit them. I created an entire backstory for her, an art gallery owner from Seattle who was brilliant but damaged, successful but emotionally available, someone who would appeal to Damien's savior complex and his need to feel superior to everyone around him. Through Rebecca, I convinced him to make increasingly risky financial decisions. She suggested investments in cryptocurrency and tech startups that I knew would fail based on my research into market trends. She encouraged him to expand the hotels too quickly, taking on debt that would become unsustainable when the economy shifted. She praised his independence and convinced him that he didn't need Sloan or her family's money to be successful. "You're so much smarter than everyone gives you credit for," Rebecca would text him. "Why are you limiting yourself with this engagement? You could build something so much bigger on your own." After 8 months of digital romance, Damien was ready to leave Sloan for a woman who existed only in his laptop screen. He started cheating openly, taking Rebecca on expensive dates to restaurants where I knew Sloan's friends would see him. He bought her jewelry and booked weekend getaways to romantic destinations. All for a woman who was actually me, sitting in a psychiatric hospital computer lab, systematically destroying his life one romantic text message at a time. The hotels he took Rebecca to were always competitors to our family businesses. I'd researched which establishments would give him the worst service, the most overpriced meals, the least impressive experiences. By the time he realized Rebecca didn't exist, he'd also wasted tens of thousands of dollars at places that would never give him good recommendations or referrals. When Sloan finally discovered the affair through photos posted on social media by her own friends, I made sure she also found evidence of his financial crimes. As Rebecca, I'd convinced Damien to share details about his brilliant business strategies, which I then screenshot and anonymously sent to Sloan's father. The Whitmore family didn't just cancel the engagement, they threatened legal action for attempted fraud and began their own investigation into Damien's hotel operations. They'd been planning to invest $40 million in a joint venture with our hotels. When they discovered the embezzlement and financial instability, they not only withdrew their investment, but also spread word throughout the industry about Damien's criminal activities. But the personal destruction was just foreplay. The real revenge required patience and perfect timing. I'd learned that the FBI had been investigating money laundering in the regional hospitality industry for over a year. Their investigation had focused on several hotel chains suspected of washing drug money through room bookings and restaurant transactions, but they hadn't yet discovered the connection to our family businesses. I began feeding them information gradually, creating a trail of evidence that would eventually lead them directly to Damien's door. Anonymous tips about suspicious cash transactions that I'd fabricated in the hotel records. Copies of bank records showing the offshore accounts I'd discovered. Evidence of the inflated vendor contracts and employee payroll skimming. The key was making it look like the FBI had discovered the evidence through their own investigation, not through tips from an outside source. I planted digital breadcrumbs that would lead them from one discovery to the next, building a case so compelling that they'd have no choice but to investigate thoroughly. I also hacked into his devices and started a psychological warfare campaign designed to make him paranoid and unstable. His computer would randomly blue screen during important video conferences with investors. His phone would call his ex-girlfriend at 3 a.m., playing recordings of him admitting to various affairs that I'd spliced together from his Rebecca conversations. His smart home system became my favorite tool for harassment. I'd turn on all the lights at random intervals throughout the night, then play opera music at full volume when he tried to sleep. I'd set his thermostat to 85 degrees in summer and 55 degrees in winter. I'd program his television to turn on in the middle of the night, always tuned to news reports about white-collar crime and prison sentences. Each incident was small enough to seem like technical glitches, but frequent enough to make him paranoid and exhausted. He started seeing patterns that weren't there, jumping at shadows, questioning whether someone was deliberately sabotaging him. The irony was delicious. He was experiencing the same paranoia he'd used to justify my commitment, except his paranoia was completely justified. During my second year at Riverside, I became the model patient. I attended every therapy session, participated enthusiastically in group activities, and showed steady improvement in my mental health assessments. I learned to mimic the recovery patterns that would convince Dr. Holloway to recommend my discharge. But I also made sure to build genuine relationships with other patients and staff members who would serve as witnesses to my mental stability. I helped Maria with her homework when she enrolled in GED classes. I played chess with Frank every Tuesday afternoon and listened to his war stories. I organized birthday parties for Dorothy when her family forgot important dates. The nursing staff began to see me as a positive influence on the ward. I was the patient who calmed down others during anxiety attacks, who helped new arrivals adjust to the routine, who never caused problems or broke rules. My therapist noted my remarkable progress and genuine insight into my condition. The truth was, Dr. Holloway was getting nervous. The hospital administration was pressuring him to discharge long-term patients to free up beds for more acute cases, and my insurance company was starting to ask pointed questions about the necessity of extended treatment for someone who showed clear signs of improvement. More importantly, I discovered that Dr. Holloway had been falsifying records for dozens of patients over the years, keeping people committed longer than medically necessary to maximize his payments from family members who wanted inconvenient relatives out of the way. His client list was a who's who of wealthy families with dark secrets. Elderly parents whose children wanted early access to inheritances, mentally ill relatives whose families wanted them warehoused permanently, political dissidents whose families wanted them silenced, Even perfectly sane spouses whose partners wanted them declared incompetent for divorce proceedings. I began anonymously reporting his crimes to the state medical board, providing them with evidence of his falsified records and financial arrangements with families. The investigation was moving slowly. Medical boards are notoriously reluctant to discipline doctors, but it was moving. By month 20, I had everything I needed. The FBI investigation was nearly complete. They just needed one more piece of evidence to obtain warrants for Damien's arrest. The IRS audit had uncovered millions in unreported income and suspicious transactions. His business partnerships were dissolving as competitors backed away from the increasingly unstable hotels. His restaurants were hemorrhaging money as online reviews and health department complaints mounted. But I wanted him to suffer personally, not just financially. I wanted him to experience the same helplessness and betrayal that I'd felt during those first months of imprisonment. So I orchestrated the final phase of my revenge with the precision of a Swiss watch. First, I arranged for Rebecca to break up with him in the most humiliating way possible. She sent him a video message recorded in what appeared to be a luxury hotel room, revealing that she'd been recording all their intimate conversations and sharing them with his business associates. "Did you really think someone like me would fall for someone like you?" She laughed in the video. "You're pathetic, Damien. A middle-aged man so desperate for affection that you'd fall in love with a complete stranger on the internet. I've been using you for money and entertainment this whole time." She told him she'd never loved him. She'd been catfishing him for months, collecting information about his business practices and personal weaknesses. She mocked his romantic poetry and sexual fantasies. She called him a weak, delusional man who was so lonely that he'd destroyed his engagement for someone who didn't exist. The video was devastating because every cruel word was true. He had been pathetic and desperate. He had fallen in love with someone he'd never met. He had betrayed his fiancée and destroyed his business relationships for a fantasy. Then I sent copies of all the Rebecca conversations to Sloan, along with photos of Damien at romantic dinners and weekend getaways. But I also included evidence that Rebecca didn't exist, proof that he'd been having an emotional affair with someone who was catfishing him, screenshots showing that the photos Rebecca had sent were actually stock images, evidence that her social media accounts had been created specifically to target him. It was the perfect humiliation. He'd lost his fiancée not for another woman, but for his own desperate delusions. The night before my scheduled release, I uploaded everything to a secure server and sent copies to the FBI, the local news, the board of directors who actually controlled the inheritance, and the state medical board for Dr. Holloway's license review. But I also sent one final package to Damien himself, a comprehensive dossier of every crime he'd committed, every lie he'd told, every life he'd destroyed. Photos of our parents' sabotaged car with detailed annotations explaining his murder technique. Audio recordings of his calls with Dr. Holloway plotting my indefinite imprisonment. Bank records showing every stolen dollar with forensic accounting details. Screenshots of his conversations with Rebecca, revealing the real identity of his online girlfriend. The package included a handwritten note. "I know what you did to our parents. I know what you did to me. I know everything. You have 24 hours to confess before the FBI finds the evidence I've left for them. Choose wisely, brother. Love, Vera." I timed the delivery perfectly. He would receive the package on the morning I was discharged, giving him just enough time to panic before I arrived home. Damien picked me up from the hospital that morning, all smiles and fake concern. He'd gained 30 pounds from stress eating and his hair was thinning rapidly. The man who'd once been confident and commanding now looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hands shook when he gripped the steering wheel, and he kept glancing at his phone as if expecting bad news. "Ready to come home, sis? I've kept everything exactly how you left it." I smiled back, carrying my small bag of possessions and the discharge papers that proclaimed me mentally stable and ready to reintegrate into society. "More than you know." He kept trying to make conversation during the drive, asking about my treatment and my plans for the future. But his voice was strained, and I could see the panic in his eyes. He'd received my package that morning. I'd timed the delivery perfectly. "How are the hotels doing?" I asked innocently, watching his knuckles turn white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Great, great. Everything's running smoothly. I think you'll be really proud of how I've managed things." His voice cracked slightly on the word managed. "And how's Sloan? Are you still engaged?" His jaw tightened. "We're taking a break. Wedding planning is stressful, you know." When we arrived at the mansion, I noticed immediately how much had changed. The gardens were overgrown and unkempt. Several windows on the second floor were boarded up, probably storm damage that Damien couldn't afford to repair. The circular driveway had potholes and cracks that hadn't been there before. One of the fountain sculptures had toppled over, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Inside was even worse. Furniture was missing from several rooms, probably sold to cover his mounting debts. The Persian rugs in the foyer had been replaced with cheap alternatives that didn't even match the color scheme. Our grandmother's crystal chandelier was gone, leaving only the mounting hardware and a sad overhead light fixture that looked like it came from a hardware store. "Had to do some redecorating," Damien said nervously when he saw me looking around. "Modernizing the place, you know, making it more contemporary." I nodded and didn't comment, but I was already calculating the value of everything he'd stolen and sold. The chandelier alone had been worth $40,000. The rugs were antiques from our great-grandmother's collection. The missing furniture included pieces that had been in the family for generations. That afternoon, exactly as I'd planned, the FBI raided all 3 hotels simultaneously. Local news crews had been tipped off, by me of course, and captured every moment as federal agents carried out boxes of financial records and computer equipment. The footage showed Damien standing in the parking lot of the flagship hotel, frantically calling his lawyers while reporters shouted questions about embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. I watched from the mansion's living room window, sipping coffee from our mother's favorite mug, while Damien's entire world collapsed in real time on the evening news. The reporters mentioned that investigators were also looking into possible connections between the hotel fraud and suspicious deaths in the family. They'd found the evidence I'd planted about our parents' murder. The news coverage was everything I'd hoped for. The lead story showed federal agents carrying computers and file boxes out of the hotels, while a voiceover explained the charges. Federal investigators raided 3 luxury hotels owned by the Patterson family today, as part of an ongoing investigation into money laundering, embezzlement, and fraud. Sources close to the investigation say the case may also involve suspicious deaths and false imprisonment of family members. When Damien finally came home that evening, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. His phone had been ringing constantly, but he'd stopped answering it. His lawyers, his business partners, his remaining friends, everyone was abandoning him as news of the investigation spread. "Vera, I can explain." "No need," I said calmly, holding up the inheritance documents that had been messengered to me that afternoon. The board of directors had expedited the transfer process once they saw evidence of his financial crimes and learned that I'd been falsely imprisoned. I already know everything. I handed him a thick manila folder containing printouts of every crime he'd committed, every lie he'd told, every law he'd broken. The murder evidence was in a separate folder, which I kept on my lap. "You have 2 choices," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You can try to fight this in court, where all of this evidence will become public record and you'll definitely spend the rest of your life in prison for murdering our parents. Or you can quietly confess to the financial crimes, return every penny you stole, and maybe get a plea deal that'll only put you away for 10 to 15 years. Damien sank into our father's old armchair, the same chair where he'd sat 24 months earlier when he explained why I needed professional help. His face had gone completely white, and I could see him calculating his options. "The murder evidence," he whispered. "How did you documented everything yourself, remember? Photos, recordings, shopping receipts, even a practice video of you sabotaging brake lines. You kept it all on your encrypted hard drive, like some kind of trophy collection." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes for the first time since I'd been dragged away in that ambulance. "You were never as smart as you thought you were, Damien. You just surrounded yourself with people too afraid or too greedy to call you out. But I had 2 years to study every mistake you made, every corner you cut, every lie you told. 2 years to plan exactly this moment." He tried to speak, but I held up my hand. 24 months of antipsychotic medications that made me drool on myself. 24 months of group therapy with actual mental patients while everyone I loved thought I was crazy. 24 months of watching you live my life, spend my money, sleep in my bed, and plan your future with my inheritance. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens our mother had planted before she died. You know what the worst part was? Not the stolen money, or even the false imprisonment. It was realizing that you'd murdered our parents and felt nothing. You documented their deaths like a science experiment. You were proud of what you'd done. When I turned back around, Damien was crying. Real tears. Not the crocodile tears he'd shed at their funeral. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. "I just needed time to establish myself in the business. I thought maybe if you were away for a few months I could prove that I was better suited to run everything." "A few months?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make him flinch. "Dr. Holloway's files show you paid him to keep me there permanently. You were planning to have me declared incompetent so you could be my legal guardian forever." I opened the second folder and showed him copies of the legal documents he'd drafted, papers that would have given him total control over my life and assets until I died. "You were going to keep me locked up until I died, Damien, just like you killed our parents. Anyone who stood between you and the money had to be eliminated." The confession came pouring out then. Everything I already knew, plus details I hadn't discovered. How he'd been planning the inheritance theft since we were teenagers. How he deliberately isolated me after our parents' deaths to make me seem unstable. How he'd bribed Dr. Holloway and several hospital staff members to ensure my continued imprisonment. He told me about the times he'd visited the hospital, not to see me, but to meet with Dr. E.I. Holloway and discuss strategies for keeping me committed. How they'd laughed about my attempts to explain what had really happened. How they'd increased my medication dosages whenever I seemed to be thinking too clearly. "I thought you'd eventually accept it," he said through his tears. "I thought you'd get used to being there and stop fighting it. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted what was rightfully mine." "Rightfully yours?" The rage I'd been controlling for 2 years finally broke through. "You murdered our parents. You stole my inheritance. You had me imprisoned and drugged. What part of any of that was rightfully yours?" He couldn't answer because there was no answer. He'd convinced himself that he deserved everything because he was older, because he was male, because he was willing to do things that I wasn't. But when faced with the reality of what he'd done, even he couldn't justify it. The FBI arrested him 3 days later. The local news covered every detail of his perp walk, from the handcuffs to the federal courthouse to the orange jumpsuit. I gave an exclusive interview to the investigative reporter who'd broken the story, detailing my false imprisonment and the evidence I'd gathered from inside the psychiatric hospital. The interview was devastating for everyone involved in the conspiracy. Dr. Holloway was arrested for medical fraud and conspiracy. Several hospital administrators were fired for failing to prevent patient abuse. Mrs. Patterson was charged as an accessory for her role in providing false testimony about my mental state. But the most satisfying moment came during Damien's sentencing hearing. He'd taken a plea deal rather than face trial for murder, agreeing to confess to the financial crimes in exchange for a lighter sentence. But I'd made sure the families of his other victims, the patients Dr. C.R. Holloway had falsely imprisoned, were present in the courtroom. One by one, they stood up and told their stories. Elderly parents who'd been warehoused in psychiatric facilities while their children stole their savings. Political activists who'd been silenced by corrupt family members. Vulnerable adults who'd been trapped in the system for years while their relatives plundered their assets. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked directly at Damien. Your Honor, my brother didn't just steal money. He stole 2 years of my life, my relationship with my family, and my faith in the people who were supposed to protect me. He murdered our parents for financial gain and then tried to have me permanently imprisoned to cover up his crimes. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. But he also underestimated me. He thought that putting me in a psychiatric hospital would make me helpless and silent. Instead, it gave me time to think, to plan, and to gather evidence of every crime he'd committed. He thought he was getting rid of the only person who could expose him. Instead, he created his own worst enemy. I looked around the courtroom at the other victims and their families. My brother believed that vulnerable people exist only to be exploited by those with more power. He was wrong. We're stronger than he ever imagined, and we don't forget. We don't forgive, and we don't give up. Damien received 25 years to life for murder in the first degree, plus additional sentences for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. With good behavior, he might be eligible for parole when he's 70 years old. Dr. Holloway lost his license and received 15 years for medical fraud and conspiracy. The hospital paid millions in settlements to the families of patients who'd been falsely imprisoned, and several administrators faced criminal charges. Mrs. Patterson received probation and community service for her role in the conspiracy, but she also had to pay restitution for the money Damien had given her. She lost her house and had to move in with her daughter across the country. The hotels and restaurants were transferred back to me, along with punitive damages from insurance policies and the liquidation of Damien's personal assets. I hired new management teams and spent months rebuilding the businesses he'd nearly destroyed. But I also used my experience to create something positive from the horror I'd endured. I established the Vera Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting patients' rights in psychiatric facilities and exposing medical fraud. We investigate complaints about false imprisonment, provide legal assistance to families fighting corrupt doctors, and lobby for stronger oversight of mental health institutions. The foundation also provides financial assistance to people who've been victims of inheritance theft or family fraud. We've helped dozens of families recover stolen assets and prosecute relatives who've exploited vulnerable family members. Most importantly, we've created a network of survivors who support each other and share information about corrupt doctors, fraudulent facilities, and predatory family members. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse that targets vulnerable people who can't fight back. I never married or had children. The years I spent in that hospital changed me in fundamental ways, and I've never been able to trust people the way I did before. But I've built a meaningful life focused on protecting others from experiencing what I went through. The mansion feels different now, lighter somehow, even though I live there alone. I've restored the gardens our mother planted and replaced all the furniture Damien sold. I've turned his old bedroom into an office for the foundation, and his private bathroom is now a file storage room filled with case documents. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on cases similar to mine, I think about the 2 years I spent planning his destruction. People often ask if I feel guilty about what I did to him, if I think I went too far in my revenge. The answer is simple. He murdered our parents and stole 2 years of my life. He would have kept me imprisoned forever if he could have. He felt no guilt about what he did to me, no remorse for the lives he destroyed in pursuit of money and power. I gave him exactly what he deserved. Nothing more, nothing less. The last time I saw Damien was during his sentencing hearing. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he looked back at me one final time. I saw fear in his eyes, and desperation, and something that might have been regret. But I also saw the same calculating expression he'd worn that night when he had me committed. Even facing life in prison, he was already trying to figure out how to manipulate the system, how to work the angles, how to eventually get what he wanted. Some people never change. They just get better at hiding who they really are. I smiled at him and mouthed the words, "See you never, brother." Then I walked out of that courtroom and into the rest of my life. The life I'd fought 2 years to reclaim, and the life I'd spent 2 years learning to protect.